The moment I saw my own driveway filled with strangers' cars, I realized someone else had started living my life without ever asking my permission. I still remember tightening my hands around the steering wheel as I slowly turned into the gravel driveway leading to my beach house on the North Carolina coast. The familiar scent of salt air drifted through the open window, mixing with the warm sunshine that always welcomed me home. For nearly 30 years, this place had been my sanctuary. My late husband and I had spent countless weekends restoring every weathered porch board, repainting every room, and planting the sea oats that now danced in the ocean breeze. It was never the largest house on the beach, but every corner carried a memory that belonged to us. That Friday afternoon, however, nothing looked familiar. More than 20 vehicles were parked across the driveway, the lawn, and even alongside the private access road. Large coolers sat on the front porch. Children's beach toys were scattered across the sand. Folding chairs lined the deck overlooking the ocean, and colorful towels hung from the balcony railings as though a resort had suddenly appeared overnight. At first I wondered if I had somehow driven to the wrong address. Then I noticed the small driftwood sign my husband had carved by hand years ago. It still read, Morris House. I was exactly where I belonged. I simply no longer felt welcome there. I stepped out of my SUV carrying the overnight bag I had packed that morning, along with a homemade blueberry pie resting carefully inside a cooler. Before I could even close the driver's door, laughter echoed from the backyard. Voices I recognized floated through the sea breeze. My nieces. My nephews. Cousins I had not seen since Thanksgiving. Even several relatives from my late husband's side of the family. They all sounded wonderfully happy. The only problem was that no one had told me they would be here. As I walked toward the front porch, my granddaughter Luna suddenly appeared in the doorway. 14 years old, bright-eyed, and wearing a loose white sweatshirt over her swimsuit, she looked genuinely surprised to see me. "Grandma," she asked. "You came today?" I smiled warmly. "I thought I always came on the first Friday in July." She hesitated just long enough for my heart to notice. I thought Mom invited you already." Before I could answer, another familiar voice called from inside the house. "Luna, can you help me carry the snack trays?" Moments later my daughter-in-law Victoria stepped confidently onto the porch. She wore a flowing turquoise resort dress, oversized sunglasses resting on top of her long chestnut hair with its straight bangs framing her face. She looked every bit the picture of someone hosting an elegant vacation gathering. For a split second, genuine surprise crossed her face. Then it disappeared beneath a polished smile. "Cynthia," she said brightly. "You made it. Made it. Not welcome home. Not I am so glad you are here. Just made it." "Hello, Victoria," I answered politely. "It looks like everyone is having a wonderful time." "We sure are," she laughed. "I wanted to bring the whole family together for 3 days. Everybody loved the idea." I waited for the sentence I assumed would follow. Nobody mentioned asking me because they already had. Nobody apologized because they forgot to call. Nobody explained that there had been some misunderstanding. Instead, Victoria continued speaking as though every detail had already been settled. "Grayson grilled burgers earlier, tomorrow we have a beach volleyball tournament, Sunday morning is our family brunch, and I even planned professional photos at sunset." She sounded proud of herself. Around us, relatives waved cheerfully as they carried beach bags in and out of the house. Several thanked Victoria for organizing such an incredible reunion. One of my cousins smiled and said, "Your daughter-in-law has done an amazing job putting this together." Victoria accepted the compliment graciously. I simply smiled back. There are moments when correcting someone immediately only creates confusion. I had learned long ago that patience often reveals far more than confrontation. I stepped inside the house and noticed subtle changes everywhere. Fresh flowers decorated the kitchen island. Printed schedules titled Morris Family Reunion Weekend rested beside the coffee maker. Personalized welcome bags sat neatly on the dining table. My beach house had somehow become headquarters for an event I had never agreed to host. I quietly carried my pie into the kitchen and placed it on the counter. Nobody asked where I had been. Nobody asked whether I had driven the 3 hours alone. Everyone seemed convinced I had been part of the plan all along. Luna wandered beside me while the others remained busy unpacking. She lowered her voice. "Grandma, there is something I think you should know." Before she could finish, Victoria called loudly from the living room. "Everyone, gather around. There is one more surprise I saved until our official host arrived." I slowly turned toward the sound, unsure why she had just called someone else the host of my own beach house. Everyone drifted toward the living room with the relaxed excitement that always comes before a family announcement. I followed quietly, carrying nothing except the growing feeling that I had somehow become a visitor inside the home my husband and I had built together. Victoria stood beside the fireplace with effortless confidence, smiling as relatives gathered around her. The ocean shimmered beyond the tall windows behind her, and the late afternoon sunlight filled the room with the warm glow I had loved for decades. "Thank you all for making the trip," Victoria said cheerfully. "I wanted this weekend to become a new family tradition, a place where everyone could reconnect every summer." The room responded with warm applause. Several relatives nodded enthusiastically. I smiled politely, although one sentence echoed quietly inside my mind. A new family tradition. I wondered when that decision had been made, and more importantly, by whom. Victoria continued speaking with the ease of someone accustomed to organizing events. "I have planned everything from sunrise beach walks to seafood dinners, family games, and a professional photo session on Saturday evening. I even made room assignments so nobody has to worry about where they are sleeping." Several people complimented her organization. One of my nieces laughed and said, "Victoria, you thought of absolutely everything." Victoria accepted the praise gracefully. "I tried." Then she looked toward me with the same polished smile she had worn since I arrived. "Actually, Cynthia, there is one little favor I hoped you would not mind." Every conversation around the room became slightly quieter. "Of course," I answered calmly. "The downstairs guest room is completely full, and a few cousins arrived with their children at the last minute," Victoria explained. "Would you mind taking the small upstairs room? It is only for 3 nights." For a brief moment, nobody seemed to realize what she had just asked. The upstairs room she mentioned was never intended as a bedroom. It had originally been a compact storage room with a narrow daybed that my husband installed years earlier for occasional overnight fishing trips. Every other bedroom in the house overlooked the ocean. That small room overlooked the roof. I glanced toward Grayson. My son shifted slightly but remained silent. His expression suggested surprise more than agreement, yet he said nothing. I answered simply, "If that helps everyone enjoy the weekend, I can manage." Victoria smiled with visible relief. "Wonderful. I knew you would understand." Luna looked directly at me, her forehead creasing with concern. She clearly knew that room had never been my room. Halfway through the conversation, she quietly stepped beside me and whispered, "Grandma, your bedroom." Before she could finish, Victoria called for everyone to begin unpacking luggage. The moment disappeared beneath renewed excitement. I carried my overnight bag upstairs alone. When I opened the small room, I immediately recognized several boxes that normally remained stored there during the winter. Someone had simply pushed them against one wall to make enough space for the narrow bed. A portable fan sat beside the window because the room did not connect well to the central air conditioning. I smiled softly to myself. The room was perfectly usable. That was not what troubled me. What unsettled me was realizing someone had reassigned every bedroom in my own house without speaking to me once. I carefully unpacked my clothes into the small dresser and placed a framed photograph of my late husband on the nightstand, just as I always did whenever I stayed at the beach house. Looking at his familiar smile reminded me to remain patient. Emotion rarely improves difficult conversations. Downstairs, laughter echoed across the deck as relatives admired the ocean view. When I returned to the kitchen, I noticed Victoria directing everyone with impressive efficiency. "Coolers go outside. Beach towels are in the hallway closet. Extra sunscreen is under the sink. She knew exactly where everything belonged because she had spent many summers here. I had always welcomed her warmly. Watching her confidently guide people through my home should have made me proud. Instead, I felt strangely invisible. My blueberry pie still rested untouched on the counter. Victoria walked over carrying several serving platters. "Cynthia, would you mind slicing vegetables for tonight? You always do it so much better than I can." Her request sounded perfectly polite. Anyone listening would have thought she was complimenting me. I nodded and quietly began preparing the vegetables while conversations continued around me. One by one, relatives entered the kitchen, accepted drinks from Victoria, complimented the decorations, and thanked her for hosting such a beautiful weekend. Not a single person realized the woman arranging food at the cutting board was the legal owner of the house surrounding them. Luna slipped beside me again while pretending to reach for bottled water. She lowered her voice until only I could hear. "Grandma, yesterday I heard Mom talking on the phone." I paused my knife just long enough to meet her eyes. "What did she say?" Luna swallowed nervously before answering. "She told someone that after this weekend, everyone would finally start thinking of the beach house as hers instead of yours." My hands remained perfectly steady as I returned to slicing carrots, but somewhere deep inside me, I realized this reunion might never have been about bringing the family together at all. Saturday morning arrived with the gentle sound of waves rolling onto the shore and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the kitchen. For years I had believed there was no better place for family to reconnect than this house, and watching everyone laugh together should have filled me with peace. Instead, I found myself standing quietly near the breakfast table, observing how naturally Victoria had slipped into the role of hostess. She greeted every guest with cheerful confidence, handed out printed schedules, and reminded everyone about the afternoon beach games as though she had been welcoming people into this home for years. Nobody questioned it because everything appeared organized and effortless. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the back deck, hoping the ocean breeze would quiet the thoughts circling inside my mind. My husband used to tell me that the sea had a way of revealing the truth if you stayed still long enough to listen. Looking across the water, I reminded myself that assumptions could damage relationships just as easily as careless words. Luna's quiet warning stayed with me, but I needed facts before I reached any conclusions. As more relatives gathered outside, conversations naturally turned toward memories of previous vacations. One cousin thanked Victoria for keeping the family so close. Another remarked that it was wonderful to see someone younger taking charge of traditions. Victoria smiled graciously and accepted every compliment without hesitation. I noticed she never actually claimed ownership of the beach house, yet she never corrected anyone who casually spoke as though she would eventually become its permanent hostess. The distinction was subtle enough that most people would never notice it. I did. Around lunchtime everyone gathered beneath the large shade canopy overlooking the dunes. Children chased one another across the sand while adults enjoyed grilled seafood and fresh fruit. The atmosphere was relaxed, and for a while I almost convinced myself that perhaps the weekend could still become a pleasant memory. Then my cousin Linda raised her glass with a smile. "Victoria, you have done such an incredible job. Your generation is making sure this family stays together." Victoria thanked her warmly before adding, "I just want everyone to feel like this house belongs to the whole family." Several people nodded in agreement. On the surface, the sentence sounded generous. Yet something about the way she emphasized the words made me pause. This house belongs to the whole family. It was a comforting idea, but it quietly ignored one important fact. Someone had carried the responsibility for maintaining this property for 3 decades. Property taxes, insurance, storm repairs, roof replacements, plumbing emergencies, hurricane preparations, landscaping, and endless maintenance had never been shared equally. They had been my responsibility ever since my husband passed away. I never expected gratitude for that. I simply expected honesty. Halfway through lunch, an unexpected conversation caught my attention. My nephew Mark, who had not visited in years, looked toward me with genuine curiosity. "Cynthia, when did you finally decide to hand everything over to Victoria?" The table became unusually quiet. Several relatives looked between the two of us, waiting for my answer. Victoria laughed softly before I could respond. "Oh, nothing official," she said. "We have just been talking about the future a lot." The words were carefully chosen. They sounded harmless, yet they quietly suggested a future that had never been discussed with me. I smiled politely and answered in an even voice. "The future has a way of arriving one step at a time." Mark nodded without realizing the conversation had revealed far more than he intended. Victoria quickly redirected everyone's attention toward the afternoon activities, and the laughter returned almost immediately. Still, I noticed Grayson watching me from across the table. His expression carried uncertainty, as though he had heard something that did not quite fit the picture he believed existed. Later that afternoon I walked through the house checking that everyone had enough towels and extra blankets. Old habits are difficult to break. Even when I felt like a guest, I still wanted people to feel comfortable. As I passed through the hallway, I heard Victoria speaking with two distant relatives in the study. The door remained partially open. I had no intention of listening, but one sentence stopped me where I stood. "The beach house has always been the heart of this family," Victoria said confidently. "Eventually everything naturally shifts to the next generation." One relative asked, "Does Cynthia mind stepping back?" Victoria answered after a brief pause. "She knows it is time for someone else to take over." I quietly continued walking before anyone noticed I had been nearby. My heart felt heavier than it had the day before, not because of anger but because those words described a conversation that had never happened. That evening the family prepared for sunset photographs on the beach. Everyone dressed in coordinated shades of white and light blue according to Victoria's carefully planned schedule. As people lined up for pictures, the photographer approached me with a friendly smile and glanced at the printed family list clipped to his clipboard. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely, "I just want to make sure I have everyone in the correct order. Victoria marked you under the extended family section instead of the immediate family group. Was that intentional?" I looked toward Victoria standing near the shoreline, smiling confidently as she organized everyone into position, and in that quiet moment I realized the photographer had unknowingly revealed something far more important than a simple mistake on a checklist. The photographer looked from his clipboard to my face with an apologetic smile, clearly unaware that his simple question had carried far more weight than he could possibly understand. I returned his smile and answered gently, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." He nodded politely and adjusted the list without asking another question. Around us, everyone continued laughing while the evening sun painted the sky with shades of gold and coral. Victoria remained focused on arranging every branch of the family exactly where she wanted them. I watched quietly as she positioned Grayson beside herself in the center of the front row while directing cousins, nieces, and grandchildren into carefully planned groups. Then she finally turned toward me. "Cynthia, would you mind standing over there with Aunt Linda and Uncle Frank?" she asked pleasantly, pointing toward the outer edge of the gathering. There was nothing rude in her tone. In fact, anyone watching would have assumed she was simply organizing people efficiently. Yet I knew exactly what had happened moments earlier. On her printed list, I had already been placed among the extended relatives instead of the immediate family. I simply nodded and walked to the place she indicated. Luna noticed immediately. Instead of joining the group where Victoria had assigned her, she quietly walked across the sand until she stood beside me. Victoria called her name. "Luna, sweetheart, you belong in the front with us." Luna looked at her mother, then at me. "Grandma belongs with us too." The beach suddenly felt much quieter than before. Victoria forced a small smile. "We are only trying to make the picture balanced." Luna hesitated for a second before returning to the front row, but she glanced back at me with an expression that told me she understood far more than most adults realized. The photographer completed several group portraits, then asked for one final picture of the immediate family. Victoria quickly gathered Grayson and Luna beside her. Before I had the opportunity to move, the photographer politely called out, "Ma'am, would you like to join your son?" Victoria answered before I could speak. "This one is just our household." The words were delivered so naturally that several relatives barely noticed them. I did not argue. I simply stepped back and watched the camera capture smiles that looked perfect from a distance. Sometimes the most revealing moments happen without raised voices or dramatic confrontations. They arrive wrapped inside ordinary sentences that expose how someone truly sees you. After the photographs ended, everyone returned to the house to prepare for dinner. I remained on the beach for a few extra minutes, watching the tide slowly erase footprints from the sand. My husband used to say that the ocean never hurried, yet it always reached its destination. I found comfort in remembering those words because I sensed this weekend was still unfolding in ways no one else could yet see. As I walked back toward the house, Grayson caught up with me. He slipped his hands into his pockets and spoke carefully. "Mom, are you doing all right?" I smiled softly. "I am enjoying seeing everyone together." He studied my face for a moment. "Something feels different this weekend." "Does it?" I asked. He nodded slowly but seemed unable to explain what he meant. Before either of us could continue, Victoria called from the deck that dinner was almost ready. Grayson gave me an uncertain smile before walking back toward the others. I noticed that he looked over his shoulder twice before reaching the porch. During dinner the conversation remained light. People shared stories about old vacations, favorite holiday traditions, and childhood memories. Victoria moved comfortably from guest to guest, making certain every plate stayed full and every glass remained filled. She truly possessed remarkable organizational skills. Had she simply asked to host the reunion together, I would have gladly supported her. The problem had never been her willingness to lead. It was her willingness to erase. Halfway through the meal, my cousin Linda smiled warmly at me. "Cynthia, you must be relieved that Victoria enjoys taking care of everything now. It probably gives you more freedom." Before I could answer, Victoria laughed lightly. "She deserves to relax after all these years." Again, the sentence sounded generous. Yet hidden beneath its kindness was the assumption that my role had already ended. I quietly replied, "There is a difference between resting and disappearing." Linda looked thoughtfully at me before changing the subject. Victoria continued serving dessert as though nothing unusual had been said. Later that evening, after everyone gathered around the fire pit to roast marshmallows, I stepped inside the house to refill a pitcher of iced tea. As I passed the front hallway, I heard the familiar sound of tires rolling across the gravel driveway outside. Through the window I saw a dark sedan pull slowly to a stop near the front porch. A tall silver-haired gentleman stepped out carrying a leather briefcase instead of luggage. I recognized him immediately. Scott Price had not come for a family vacation. He had arrived on the exact date we had scheduled several weeks earlier, long before anyone else knew this reunion would take place. As I watched him straighten his jacket and walk toward the front door, I realized the carefully balanced picture Victoria had created was about to meet a piece of the story she had never known existed. Scott Price climbed the front steps with the same calm confidence I had known for more than 30 years. At 72, he still carried himself with quiet dignity, his silver hair neatly combed and his leather briefcase tucked comfortably beneath one arm. He had been my husband's closest friend long before he became our family attorney, and after my husband passed away, Scott had continued helping me handle every legal matter involving the beach house and the rest of my estate. His visit that evening was not unexpected to me. We had scheduled it weeks earlier to review several documents before the property insurance renewed later that summer. The only unexpected part was finding the house overflowing with relatives. Victoria opened the front door before I reached it. Her welcoming smile appeared instantly. "You must be one of the family friends. Please come in. We are having dessert outside." Scott smiled politely. "Thank you. I am here to see Cynthia Morris." Victoria nodded casually. "She is helping in the kitchen. We are in the middle of our reunion weekend." Scott glanced around the living room, taking in the decorations, luggage, and dozens of unfamiliar faces. He noticed the printed reunion schedule still resting on the coffee table. His expression remained pleasant, but I recognized the thoughtful look in his eyes. He quietly observed far more than most people realized. I walked into the foyer before Victoria could continue explaining the weekend's activities. "Good evening, Scott. His face brightened immediately. Good evening, Cynthia. I hope I am not interrupting anything important. I smiled. Not at all. You arrived exactly when we planned. Victoria looked from him to me with mild surprise. You two already had an appointment? Several weeks ago, I answered gently. I completely forgot to mention it because I did not know the house would be hosting a reunion. For just a fraction of a second, Victoria's confident smile tightened before returning to normal. Well, perhaps everything can wait until Monday, she suggested warmly. We are trying to keep the weekend focused on family. Scott answered before I could speak. Fortunately, this meeting concerns family. His voice remained friendly, but the sentence settled quietly over the room. Grayson had wandered inside after hearing unfamiliar voices, and several relatives gradually followed, curious about the visitor carrying a briefcase instead of beach towels. Nobody sensed tension yet. They simply assumed an old family friend had stopped by. Scott accepted a glass of iced tea and joined everyone in the living room. Victoria introduced him around with effortless hospitality, clearly believing she remained in complete control of the evening. I watched silently as Scott listened more than he spoke. Every few minutes someone casually referred to Victoria as the organizer of the beach house gathering. Scott acknowledged each comment with a courteous smile but offered no opinion. Years of legal practice had taught him that listening usually revealed more than questioning. Halfway through the conversation, my cousin Linda laughed and said, "Victoria practically runs this place now." Several people chuckled in agreement. Scott slowly turned toward me. Is that so? His question sounded completely innocent. I simply smiled. Victoria has certainly invested a great deal of energy into this weekend. Scott nodded thoughtfully without adding another word. That brief exchange seemed insignificant to everyone else, yet I noticed Grayson watching us carefully. Something about Scott's reaction had captured his attention. A few minutes later Victoria excused herself to check on dessert outside. The moment she stepped onto the deck, Scott quietly leaned toward me. Would you still like to review the documents tonight? He asked in a voice only I could hear. If it is convenient, I replied. Very much so, he answered. There are several items I believe should be confirmed while everyone is present. His words caused me to pause. Scott rarely chose his language carelessly. If he believed something should be confirmed before witnesses, he almost certainly had a reason. Before I could ask what he meant, Victoria returned carrying a tray of homemade peach cobbler. Dessert is ready, she announced happily. After everyone finishes eating, I thought we could share stories about the future of our family traditions. Scott looked toward her with a warm smile. That sounds like excellent timing. Victoria seemed pleased by his response, apparently interpreting it as support for her carefully planned evening. As everyone settled back into comfortable conversations, Scott placed his briefcase beside his chair but never opened it. Instead, he patiently listened while relatives discussed future vacations, annual reunions, and hopes that younger generations would continue gathering at the beach house for many years to come. Several people spoke as though those plans had already been decided. Scott never interrupted a single person. He simply folded his hands and waited. Nearly an hour passed before he finally looked at me again. Cynthia, he said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear, whenever you are ready, there is one document in particular that I believe every member of the immediate family should understand before the weekend continues. The conversations around the room slowly faded into silence. Victoria smiled politely, although a hint of uncertainty crossed her face for the first time since the reunion began. She glanced toward the unopened leather briefcase resting beside Scott's chair, and I noticed her expression change ever so slightly when he reached down, released the brass clasps, and carefully lifted out a thick blue folder with my full legal name printed across the front. Scott rested the blue folder on the coffee table without opening it immediately. The room had become unusually quiet. Even the children playing on the back deck seemed farther away as the steady sound of the ocean drifted through the open windows. My relatives exchanged curious glances, wondering why an ordinary summer reunion had suddenly taken on such a serious tone. Victoria remained composed, although I noticed she folded her hands together a little tighter than before. Grayson moved closer to where I was sitting, his expression thoughtful rather than anxious. Luna quietly took the empty chair beside me without saying a word. Scott looked around the room with the calm patience that had made him such a respected attorney for decades. "First," he said warmly, "I hope everyone has enjoyed being together this weekend. Family gatherings become more valuable with every passing year." Several people nodded. His voice carried no hint of accusation. It sounded more like a trusted friend sharing practical advice. Then he turned toward me. "Cynthia, before we review the documents we scheduled, I would like to confirm one simple fact for everyone's understanding." I smiled and nodded. "Of course." Scott carefully opened the folder and removed a single document protected inside a clear sleeve. "According to the current county records," he said evenly, "this beach house remains solely owned by Cynthia Morris. There are no co-owners, no transfers of ownership, and no pending changes recorded." The statement was delivered without drama, yet it settled over the room with unmistakable weight. Victoria blinked once before offering a polite smile. "I do not think anyone questioned that." Scott returned her smile with equal courtesy. "Perhaps not intentionally. However, I have listened carefully this evening, and I thought clarity would benefit everyone." No one spoke for several long seconds. Finally, my cousin Linda looked embarrassed. "I suppose we all assumed." Her voice faded before she finished the sentence. Scott gently continued. "Assumptions often grow from simple misunderstandings. That is why accurate information matters." Victoria shifted comfortably in her chair and answered with confidence. "I never meant to imply anything different. I only wanted everyone to enjoy themselves." "I believe that," Scott replied kindly. "Hosting a successful gathering requires considerable effort." His tone remained respectful, leaving no room for anyone to feel publicly criticized. The conversation could have ended there, but Grayson quietly asked the question that everyone else seemed hesitant to voice. "Then why did you feel it was important to mention ownership tonight?" Scott closed the folder halfway before answering. "Because property ownership carries responsibility as well as authority. Organizing an event at someone else's home is always best done with their knowledge and consent. That protects relationships as much as legal interests." The room became silent again. Nobody argued with the statement because it sounded like simple common sense. I looked toward Victoria. For the first time all weekend, she avoided meeting my eyes. Halfway through the conversation, Luna spoke softly. "Grandma never even knew we were coming." Her words were not angry. They were simply honest. Several relatives slowly turned toward me. Aunt Linda looked genuinely surprised. "Cynthia, you mean you did not know about this reunion beforehand?" I answered calmly. "No. I arrived expecting a quiet weekend and found all of you already here." Expressions around the room changed almost immediately. Confusion replaced certainty. My nephew Mark frowned slightly. "I thought Victoria said everyone had already talked about it together." Victoria looked from one face to another before speaking. I believed everyone would enjoy the surprise once they arrived. I honestly thought it would all work out. There was no shouting. No accusations. Only a growing realization that good intentions could still create painful situations when respect was forgotten. Scott folded his hands. "This is precisely why clear communication matters within families. People can unintentionally cross boundaries they never intended to cross." I appreciated the way he framed the discussion. He was correcting behavior without humiliating anyone. Grayson lowered his head for a moment before looking at me. "Mom, is that why you have been so quiet all weekend?" I smiled gently. I wanted everyone to enjoy being together before we talked about anything difficult. My answer seemed to affect him more than any criticism could have. He slowly looked around the room, noticing details that had escaped him before. The small upstairs room where I had been sleeping. The printed schedules Victoria had prepared without consulting me. The Conversations that assumed decisions had already been made. Piece by piece, the weekend began fitting together differently in his mind. Scott reached into the folder again and removed another sealed envelope. Unlike the first document, this one carried my late husband's signature across the bottom of the cover page. Scott rested his hand lightly on the envelope but did not open it. "There is one additional matter," he said carefully. "Your husband asked me many years ago to share these instructions only if a particular situation ever arose." Every eye in the room focused on the envelope. Even Victoria stared at it with visible uncertainty. Grayson looked at Scott in surprise. "My father left instructions?" Scott nodded once. "Yes. And after everything I observed this weekend, I believe the time has finally come for your family to hear what he wanted all of you to remember about this house." Scott held the sealed envelope with both hands for a quiet moment before carefully opening it. The only sounds in the room were the distant waves outside and the occasional creak of the old beach house settling into the evening air. Every face around me reflected a different emotion. Some looked curious. Others appeared uneasy. Grayson leaned forward in his chair while Luna rested both hands in her lap, watching Scott with complete attention. Victoria remained remarkably composed, but the confidence that had carried her through the entire weekend seemed noticeably quieter now. Scott unfolded several neatly preserved pages and smiled gently. "These are not legal demands," he explained. "Your husband wanted them written so his family would understand why he and Cynthia made certain decisions." He adjusted his glasses and began reading. "If you are hearing these words, it means time has continued without me, and I hope my family is still gathering beneath this roof with laughter instead of silence. Cynthia and I never built this house simply to own another piece of property. We built it because we wanted every generation to remember that home is created by respect before it is protected by walls." No one moved. Even the youngest children who had wandered inside sat quietly. Near the staircase, sensing that something important was happening, Scott continued reading. "Whoever opens the front door should always remember that being welcomed into this house is a privilege created through kindness, never an entitlement created through expectation." I lowered my eyes for a moment, hearing my husband's voice in every carefully chosen sentence. It felt as though he had somehow joined us again for one final family conversation. Halfway through the letter, Scott paused briefly before continuing. "One day our son will build traditions of his own. His family will laugh here. His children will grow here. New memories should always be encouraged. But I ask one thing above everything else. Never allow the person who carried this family through its hardest years to become invisible inside the very home she protected." The room remained completely silent. I noticed Grayson slowly close his eyes as those words settled over him. When he looked back at me, there was unmistakable regret in his expression. He was not remembering one difficult weekend. He was remembering dozens of small moments over the past several years that suddenly appeared very different. Scott folded the letter carefully before looking toward Grayson. "Your father was not concerned about ownership nearly as much as he was concerned about gratitude." Grayson nodded slowly. "I understand that now." Victoria remained seated, her hands folded together. She finally spoke in a quiet voice. "I never wanted Cynthia to feel invisible." Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself seemed to invite honesty rather than defensiveness. After several moments, I looked at Victoria and smiled gently. "I believe you wanted everyone to enjoy this weekend." She looked relieved for an instant. Then I continued softly. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing the difference between organizing a family gathering and replacing the person who always welcomed everyone here." Victoria lowered her eyes. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. For the first time since the reunion began, she simply listened. Luna quietly reached over and took my hand. That simple gesture carried more comfort than any speech possibly could. Scott returned the letter to its protective folder before speaking again. "There is one final matter your husband instructed me to address whenever I believed the appropriate time had arrived." Victoria looked up immediately. Several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Scott removed another document from the folder, but instead of placing it on the table, he handed it directly to me. "Cynthia," he said warmly, "this decision has always belonged entirely to you." I looked down at the familiar signature on the final page before raising my eyes toward my family. I had reviewed this document several times over the years, but until that evening I had never seriously considered acting upon it. Grayson watched me carefully. "Mom, what is it?" I rested the papers on my lap before answering. "Several years ago your father and I created a family use agreement for this house." Confused expressions spread across the room. Scott explained calmly. "It does not change ownership. Cynthia remains the sole owner. Instead, it establishes the conditions under which anyone, including family members, may use the property in the future." Victoria's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Scott continued, "The agreement was designed to preserve family harmony by making expectations clear for everyone equally." No one objected. In fact, several relatives quietly nodded as though the idea sounded perfectly reasonable. Grayson looked at me with genuine concern. "Have you already decided what you want to do?" I smiled softly. "Not yet." That answer surprised everyone, including Victoria. She had expected either immediate forgiveness or immediate consequences. Instead, I offered neither. Scott closed the blue folder and stood beside his chair. "The agreement becomes effective only if Cynthia chooses to activate it." I slowly looked around the room at every familiar face, remembering birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and countless summers shared beneath this roof. This house had never been about winning or losing. It had always been about preserving what mattered most. Then I folded the agreement carefully and placed it beside my husband's letter before. Quietly saying the one sentence no one had expected to hear. "Tomorrow morning, before anyone packs a single suitcase, I have one decision to make, and every person staying under this roof deserves to hear it together." The beach house felt unusually peaceful when I woke the next morning. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors, and the steady rhythm of the waves reminded me why my husband had always called this place our anchor. I brewed a pot of coffee before anyone else came downstairs, carrying my favorite mug onto the back porch where I had watched hundreds of sunrises over the years. The previous evening had not ended with anger or accusations. Instead, it had ended with quiet reflection, and somehow that felt far more powerful. Families rarely change because someone raises their voice. They change because the truth finally becomes impossible to ignore. One by one, the rest of the family gathered in the dining room after breakfast. Conversations were softer than they had been all weekend. Nobody rushed to discuss beach games or afternoon plans. Even the children sensed that something important was about to happen. Scott remained seated near the fireplace, his blue folder resting beside him, but he made no effort to speak. This decision belonged entirely to me. I stood near the large windows overlooking the ocean and looked around the room. Every face represented years of birthdays, graduations, weddings, holiday dinners, and shared memories. That was exactly why I had remained silent for so long. I had never wanted one painful conversation to become the memory that replaced all the beautiful ones. I smiled gently before speaking. "First, I want every one of you to know that I am grateful you came together this weekend. Seeing this house filled with family has reminded me why your father and I worked so hard to keep it." Several relatives nodded quietly. I continued. "But a home cannot stay healthy if respect quietly disappears while everyone is busy enjoying themselves." Nobody interrupted. Victoria looked directly at me for the first time since Scott had read my husband's letter. There were no excuses in her expression now, only careful attention. I picked up the family use agreement and held it where everyone could see it. "Your father and I created this years ago because we believed clear expectations protect families better than silent assumptions." Grayson leaned forward slightly. Luna watched every word with complete focus. Halfway through my remarks, I paused and looked at Victoria. I could activate this agreement today and immediately require that every future visit, every overnight stay, and every gathering receive my written approval in advance. That would certainly prevent misunderstandings. Victoria lowered her eyes, accepting whatever decision I chose to make. The room remained perfectly still. Then I smiled. I am going to activate it. A quiet murmur passed through the room. Before anyone could misunderstand my intention, I continued speaking. Not as a punishment. As a promise. Confused expressions slowly gave way to curiosity. I opened the document and explained each guideline one by one. Every family gathering would be planned together. Anyone wishing to host an event would first speak with me directly while I remained the owner. Overnight guests would always be discussed beforehand. House maintenance responsibilities would be shared fairly by anyone regularly using the property. Most importantly, every decision affecting the beach house would begin with a conversation instead of an assumption. No one objected. In fact, several relatives quietly admitted the guidelines sounded practical and fair. My cousin Linda smiled warmly. Honestly, Cynthia, that probably would have prevented this entire misunderstanding. I nodded. That was always the idea. Victoria slowly stood from her chair. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. May I say something? I smiled. Of course. She turned toward everyone before looking back at me. I believed I was helping this family. Somewhere along the way I started acting as though organizing everything gave me the right to make decisions that were never mine to make. I never asked because I convinced myself that everyone would appreciate the surprise. I understand now that I confused enthusiasm with permission. No one rushed to respond. Her apology did not sound rehearsed. It sounded honest. Then she faced me completely. Cynthia, I am sorry that I made you feel like a guest inside your own home. The room remained silent while I considered her words. Finally I walked across the room and gently placed my hand over hers. Thank you for saying that. Relief appeared across Grayson's face almost instantly. Luna smiled through eyes that had grown unexpectedly emotional. Scott quietly closed his folder, clearly recognizing that no legal document could accomplish what a sincere conversation had just begun. As everyone prepared to clear the breakfast table together, Victoria reached for the printed reunion schedules she had created before the weekend. Without saying anything, she folded each one neatly and set them aside. Then she looked at me with a respectful smile. Would you help me plan next summer's gathering? She asked. I looked toward the ocean before answering because the question carried far more meaning than anyone else realized. After everything that had happened, my answer would determine not only the future of this beach house but the future of our family, and every person in the room waited quietly to hear the single word I would choose. I looked at Victoria for several quiet seconds before answering the question that everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath to hear. Then I smiled. Yes, I said. I would like us to plan it together. A gentle wave of relief moved across the room. Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment before smiling back, and I could see that she understood my answer was not simply forgiveness. It was an invitation to rebuild trust one conversation at a time. Grayson let out a slow breath and wrapped one arm around Luna's shoulders. Scott quietly gathered his papers, his work finished without needing another word. The rest of the morning unfolded differently from every hour that had come before it. Nobody rushed to give instructions. Nobody assumed responsibilities that had not been discussed. Instead, people naturally began asking simple questions that somehow carried far greater meaning than they ever had before. Where would you like these chairs? Should we clean the upstairs first? Would this work for you, Cynthia? They were ordinary questions, but respect often reveals itself through ordinary moments. Before lunch, Victoria walked upstairs and returned carrying my overnight bag from the small room. She stopped in front of everyone and smiled with quiet humility. Your room has been ready for you all along, she said softly. I should have remembered whose home this is before I started assigning spaces. She had already moved my belongings back into the master bedroom overlooking the ocean. I thanked her without making the moment larger than it needed to be because genuine change rarely requires an audience. That afternoon the family packed beach chairs, folded umbrellas, and cleaned every room together before anyone loaded a single suitcase into a car. Nobody treated the work as a chore. Somehow it felt like every person was contributing to something they had finally learned to appreciate. Luna slipped her hand into mine while we watched everyone carry supplies from the deck. "Grandma," she whispered, "this feels different now." I smiled. "It is." "Why?" she asked. I looked around at the family working side by side. "Because everyone finally remembers that a house is something you own, but a home is something you protect together." She nodded thoughtfully, and I knew she would remember that lesson long after she forgot the details of this weekend. Before leaving, Victoria approached me one last time. She handed me every extra key she had distributed before the reunion began. "These belong with you," she said. I accepted the keys before placing one back into her hand. She looked surprised. "I still want you to have one," I explained. "The difference is that now we both understand what that key represents." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she smiled. "I will never forget that." Grayson embraced me longer than he had in years. "I should have noticed sooner," he admitted quietly. "I was so busy trying to keep everyone happy that I forgot to ask how you were feeling." I gently squeezed his hand. "Now you know. That is enough." Scott shook my hand before leaving and smiled toward the beach house. "Your husband would have been proud today," he said. "Not because you defended the property, but because you protected the family." His words stayed with me long after his car disappeared down the road. Nearly 1 year later, the beach house welcomed another family reunion. This time the invitations were written together. Victoria called me months in advance to discuss dates, sleeping arrangements, meals, and activities. She asked for my ideas before making any plans, and I asked for hers with equal sincerity. The schedule that greeted everyone on the kitchen counter carried 2 names across the top instead of 1. Beneath the title were the simple words, "Planned with love by Cynthia and Victoria." During our family photograph that summer, Victoria walked directly to my side before the photographer said a single word. She smiled and announced, "The heart of this family belongs in the center." No one questioned where I should stand. Luna slipped her arm through mine while Grayson stood beside us, and the camera captured something far more valuable than perfect smiles. It captured a family that had learned the difference between taking someone for granted and honoring the person who quietly held everyone together. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I looked across the porch my husband and I had built with our own hands all those years ago. The beach house still belonged to me on paper, but that was no longer the part that mattered most. What mattered was that respect had finally returned before resentment had the chance to replace love. I had never needed to win an argument. I had only needed my family to remember that the strongest foundations are not poured in concrete. They are built one thoughtful choice, one honest conversation, and one act of respect at a time.